Hello. Last time we were speaking about world order, and we were also approaching the subject through our own personal histories and personal backgrounds. I said that of the various ways to classify human beings and groupings of human beings, the most superficial and meaningless way is by outer characteristics. For example, skin colour. Skin colour is not useful in making differentiations between human beings. It's counterproductive. And it also lends itself to political manipulation. So I would put it to you that it's more important to look for a sense of identity beyond the surface. So if outward characteristics like skin colour, eye colour, hair kinkiness, eye fold, height, are not significant. The next level of significance is ethnicity. And every one of us has an ethnos. Every one of us has an ethnic background. Start from there. You can consider your ethnic background. Is it Irish, for example? Is it Swahili? Is it Chinese? Is it Han Chinese? It is possible to make finer differentiations, but the classification of ethnicity at least has more content and therefore more meaning than outward characteristics. Part of the content is the language you speak, perhaps the most important part of the content. Also part of the content would be customs and traditions, the types of festivals your people hold, the types of costume they wear, the types of food they eat. All of this goes to make up a people. And the classification of a people or a nationality at least has some meaning. In the old world of Europe, these peoples, the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, they tended to form their own nations. In a sense, it was more straightforward in that earlier time of history. But since the age of exploration and the opening up of the new world, in addition to the old world, and the opening up of new world-like multi-ethnic nations like Australia, in the wake of the Enlightenment, where societies or civic nations have attempted to be built on ideologies that move away from ethnicity, we have to deal with a situation of the multi-ethnic state, of the multicultural nation. And this is where a civic nationhood becomes significant. Because to be an American or to be an Australian is something more than merely belonging to a particular ethnic group. And because the world has globalized fast, and because the type of thinking and ideology that produces such modern nations has spread and is prevalent, more and more we have to understand our identity in civic terms. So that's another level of differentiation. So basically, when we're talking about civic national identity, we're talking about shared beliefs and values and allegiance to a particular nation state, allegiance, citizenship. There is always a problem when there is dual citizenship. If somebody is a citizen of more than one state, to which state is their principal loyalty? And then there are people that are part of multi-ethnic states who may, spiritually as it were, live back in the old country, and they are more preoccupied with the goings on there, the conflicts there, the politics there, and the nationhood of that old country than they are with their new adoptive country. So that can produce tensions as well. There is also, I think, the most important level of identity, if it applies to you, and I think in one way or another it applies to everybody, and that is religious affiliation. Because whether we're talking about America or Australia or anywhere else that is building a multi-ethnic nation state, it will contain adherents of different faith groupings. Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, Taoists, Shinto, although Shinto is more localized to Japan, and Japan has quite a homogeneous ethnic population, by intent too. So there are all sorts of possibilities along the spectrum. There's a whole spectrum of faith affiliations, of course, but there's also a spectrum of the basis of national identity. At one end of the spectrum is ethnonationalism, where the nation is based on ethnicity. The other end of the spectrum, you might see a purely civic nationalism, where ethnicity is quite downplayed, and one's shared values and subscription to the ideology of the new nation embodied in key documents like a constitution, a Bill of Rights, etc., institutions, takes on a greater importance. All of these things factor into world order. So, at last time I was saying that, for example, I'm an Australian citizen with a Lebanese ethnicity. And I'm also a Christian, a Catholic Christian. So all of these things factor in. And somehow or other, we seek to make a coherent sense of identity where we do the right thing by ourselves, by our families, by our communities, by our faith tradition, by our nation. And then we look out into the world and we see that because there are these different groupings, different identifications, different allegiances, they all play into the kind of world order that is produced. In the first recording of this series, I talked about the Westphalian world order that was established in 1648 after the wars of religion in Europe and the 30 Years' War, where there was a stalemate up until that point. Both the Catholic forces and the Protestant forces were fighting for supremacy. There reached a point where it was decided that this matter was not going to be solved by force of arms, and that no side could have an absolute superiority or dominance over the other side. So a wiggly line had to be drawn through Europe, and there had to be a settlement based on nation states who were on a footing of equality, whose sovereignty had to be respected, and who could enter into agreements, treaties, and alliances. There were precursors to this, of course, like the Habsburg emperors had come to, with the German electors, the princes and so on, they'd come to an acceptance of a principle which in Latin went cuius regio eius religio. Whoever rules of that prince or potentate, his religion will obtain in the realm. In other words, if you lived in a certain principality or kingdom, then whatever the religion of the ruler was, that would be the official religion. And most of the subjects would be in accord with that. Sometimes they had to develop separate treaties to give protection to minority groups within a country. For example, in France, the minority of the Huguenots, or Huguenots, who were a Protestant minority after the Reformation, but a very influential minority and prominent in business. They were given protection by the Edict of Nantes, so they effectively could become a state within a state, where the official religion of France was Catholic, but they could keep their own autonomy and govern themselves with safety in that situation. So after this time, it eventually evolved to the Westphalian point of nation states. Now, the European settlement exported itself around the world. That's why this idea is so prominent today. Even when we look at something like the League of Nations that was set up after World War II, and then the United Nations, the League of Nations that was set up after World War I, and the United Nations that was set up after World War II, there is an assumption that the world system is dealing with independent nation states who can enter into agreements and who can act collaboratively in the interests of general security. The so-called liberal international order, which has been the primary governing principle since the Second World War, and it has brought a lot of things in its train, the United Nations and all its agencies, things like the World Trade Organization, and a unified monetary system that grew up with the Bretton Woods Conference. This liberal international order, which seems to have reached its expiry date in the sense of it's not going to work expecting or forcing all the peoples of the world to subscribe to this vision of world order. That reposed on the Westphalian idea of independent sovereign nation states. And as I say, it was guided by the luminary of Immanuel Kant, the great Enlightenment philosopher who wrote a treatise on a perpetual peace, towards a perpetual peace, as I mentioned before. Which presented the belief that liberal democracies would trade together rather than fight together. So if they had more in common through their economic ties, there wouldn't be a need to go to war. So we come to the present, and when I say the present, things have been developing through the last few decades, which have reached the present, whereby we have different models of world order that are in conflict. This is conflict at a global level. It's like interfaith conflict. We started off talking about conflict on all four levels, the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, the intra-faith and the interfaith. Well, looking at world order, we're coming at it more from a political angle. And we're looking at a clash, a conflict of different views of world order. Now, of course, there are more than two players in the field, but one big dynamic and tension is between this Westphalian notion of nation states and order of nation states and religious ideas of bringing the whole world into a system that may be more theocratic or is in conformity to the tenets of a particular religion. I mentioned Islam and Islamism. Now, with Islamism, you're getting the fusion of religion and politics. And this is a distinctive feature of Islam. And it's something that the peacemaker and the peace educator and all people involved in diplomacy, foreign policy and international relations need to understand, that throughout Islam's history, there has been a closer connection between religion and politics, even a fusion. And that's where we get the Islamism from. It's Islam applied in the political field, in the political arena, so that the religion is fully implemented in a culture under a caliphate. Iran, for example, has a very different notion of world order than the United States. But in Islam, generally, the notions of world order all converge at some kind of world order which does not set as its highest standard or priority a harmonious relationship of nation states. We talked about the concepts of the House of Islam and the House of War. So there is peace and order and Sharia justice in the House of Islam, and outside of that, there's chaos. But there's always been the aspiration, whether we look at Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood that arose in the early part of the 20th century in Egypt, with such ideologues as al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb. Ultimately, the whole Western, it's not simply a reaction against Western influences, Western cultures, Western ways of thought, but a presentation of a radical alternative to the Western conception, or I should really qualify that. It's not the sole Western conception, but it is a dominant one, the Westphalian conception of world order. So we've got lines drawn on a map and national boundaries. And anybody who is, say, ethnically Lebanese or comes from that part of the world knows that the people from which they came have been under different arrangements of governance throughout history. Which is the real one? Which is the permanent one? Which is the most significant one? At one point, they were the Phoenicians who extended their colonies around northern Africa, Carthage and so on. At another point, they were under the Romans. At another point, under the Byzantine Empire. Under another point, under the caliphates. They were the early caliphates. And then there were the Crusader kingdoms that came into Lebanon. It wasn't called Lebanon, the state of Lebanon. And then there was the Ottoman Empire until after World War I. And after World War I, the world saw the demise of a number of empires, including the Romanov dynasty in Russia, and the Ottomans, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which derived from the Habsburgs, etc. The Hohenzollern Empire. So then the British mandate for Palestine came into play. And so my ancestors would have lived under that. And then after the end of the Second World War, the Middle East was divided up into mandates again. There was the French mandate for Syria and Lebanon, and the British mandate for Iraq and Jordan and Palestine. So only since 1946 has there been a state of Lebanon, a political entity, which seems to resemble a Westphalian state. It's very complicated. At the moment, I believe Lebanon doesn't even have a president. But in the late 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, up to the outbreak of the Civil War, which lasted from 1975 to 1990, Lebanon was an example, a bit of a model of an interfaith polity. Perhaps unique as a confessional system of governance. There would be a Catholic Maronite president of the country, a Sunni Muslim prime minister, and a Shia as Speaker of the House. And people would organise along confessional or religious lines. Everything became complicated with the outbreak of the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, with a lot of external powers involved. And this whole area, Lebanon, and then what became Israel and so on, has become a battlefield, not just between the locals but a battlefield for different conceptions of world order. And I say all of this to give myself as an example, but you will have to do the reasoning in your own situation. And it's hard enough to work out my ethnicity when I think, okay, I've got a Lebanese ethnicity. What do I understand by Lebanon and Lebanese? That's complicated. It's a lot easier to, at least on the surface, to know what I mean when I say I'm an Australian citizen. But then once we start drilling down, it's not so easy to define what an Australian is and what Australia is. That can become complicated too. So whatever your heritage and whatever your religious affiliation and whatever your national identity is, try to go through an exercise like this and also ask yourself, how does the identity that I've grown up with, and how do the larger groupings to which I belong play into this competition of world order? Are we going to come to some sort of truce between different ideas of world order? Or is one going to emerge supreme? They are interesting questions to ask.